So for our last main segment of the evening, I'd like to welcome Luke Norris, who serves on our board. He's also the Director of Government Relations for Code for America nationally, to get a little bit more national perspective on what's happening here and sort of how this human impact side of what we're doing and how we think about technology is being looked at other parts around the country. Luke Norris. Thanks.
Thanks. So as Aaron said, I work in government relations for a national nonprofit and have the opportunity to travel around to hundreds of cities every year and not only represent and talk about what we've been doing in Kansas City, but also hear about the amazing things that are actually happening in other cities and have a unique perspective both in looking at some of the initiatives that private philanthropy has driven forward in some of those communities, but also some of the things that cities are doing, and certainly want to represent that we have been leaders, but we are on this really unique tipping point of potentially becoming followers. And we need to maintain that leadership position. And one of the ways that we can do that is with the support of institutional philanthropy. So I'm excited to introduce a few folks that will join me to have a conversation about the role of institutional philanthropy, but also the things that cities and local governments can do. So via Skype, in embracing true digital technology, is Alaina Harkness, who is a program officer with the MacArthur Foundation based out of Chicago. Dane Stangler, the Vice President of Research and Policy from the Kauffman Foundation, is also here with us tonight, as well as Deb Socia, the Executive Director of Next Century Cities, each of whom will have a few minutes to talk about some things they're doing. So Dane and Deb, if you want to come up, and we'll get Alaina here on the screens for everyone. Alaina, you can hear us?
I can.
And we can hear you, so this is great. And we don't even have gigabit speed here, so this is really great. So Alaina, one of the things I would love to ask you, when many of us think of Chicago, right, we think of the epicenter in some ways of the Midwest outside of Kansas City, of course. But the thing that I think is really interesting about Chicago is Chicago has benefited from the technology infrastructure as a platform without infrastructure like we have in Kansas City. And certainly you and MacArthur Foundation have played a really big role in that. And I would love to understand why you guys made the decision to invest in things and help found the Smart Chicago Collaborative and play a really big role in boosting this type of opportunity without infrastructure. And what are some of the both immediate but also secondary benefits of you've seen as a result of some of those investments?
Before I just want to say thank you to everybody for giving me the technical opportunity to participate remotely. Sorry I wasn't able to be able to join you in person. It looks like it would have been a lot more fun. This is a subject that's really near and dear to my heart. I definitely don't identify as a civic technology funder. I identify as a community development funder. And I think this problem that we have with trying to figure out who funds civic tech or who does civic tech is one that everybody in every city is facing. It's not just a problem that we face in Chicago. But most of life is really set up to think about solving problems in the kinds of impact areas all of us recognize. We're trying to fix education. We're trying to improve health. That's the way foundations, just like cities are organized. They have departments that are focused on the elements of quality of life that all of us recognize as critical to our well-being and our city's well-being. So at MacArthur, we early saw, thanks to the vision of our now President Julius Dash, how important technology and information technologies particularly were going to be in advancing every single area that we care about in the city of Chicago. No matter what we wanted to work on, whether we're looking at a way that information technology can help us do it better, to reach more people, to get deeper into the neighborhoods that were underserved, that we're trying to help. And for that need, we decided the best way to meet that would be, instead of trying to figure out how do we do that inside each of our program areas, let's think about how do we help the city distribute that kind of expertise across the entire city, across all of these areas. So really, when we look at the landscape of Chicago, the group that Aaron mentioned, Smart Chicago Collaborative, was sort of an idea at first, which was how do we figure out how to help philanthropy be smarter about investing in specific technology? How do we create a sort of center of gravity, what let's talk about as a center of gravity for technology expertise that can then be distributed out? And what Smart Chicago Collaborative does is program leaders. So we've got representation from the city of Chicago, representation from a couple of leading foundations, our community foundation and key partner forever. But most importantly, what Smart Chicago Collaborative does is figure out how to leverage resources and fund projects across all of those different domains that we concern about. And it's able to bring people together from really rich civic technology community that have Chicago technologists, coders, people that know how to do things with technology. Just the way that you guys in this room have assembled such an amazing collection of talent. Connecting those people with the folks inside Chicago's community to understand really deeply the needs of neighbors, the needs of people that are on the same program that we talked about earlier, the needs of education around health. And so that's what Smart Chicago Collaborative has done in Chicago. It's been this kind of critical piece of the missing infrastructure that we didn't have, providing expertise inside the foundation community on technology issues and helping people see, if they want to get something done in health and health domain, how information technology and leading civic tech folks in our city help them get there, help them achieve those goals faster. So that was one key investment we made out of many. The other thing we think about a lot is just how to keep the ever-changing world of data and information technologies fresh and how to keep that expertise living and infused into the nonprofit and civic sector. And the Smart Chicago Collaborative helps play that role nationally. The National Neighborhood Indicator Partnership with the Urban Institute is a fantastic network of local data partners that are thinking every day about how to make data useful to neighborhood civic development folks. And that's, it's a really important set of connections that wouldn't be made without these organizations. So, what we're doing in Chicago could be done anywhere. It really took leadership of the Community Foundation, which there's community foundations in just about every city around the country. Definitely benefited from having a private funder or set of funders who have been able to step up to the plate and fund specific projects, because this stuff doesn't happen without money. That's been very important. We also needed leadership. We needed to find those people that can really be the bridge builders and key translators. So it's people with enough technology expertise to understand how to apply it in a community context and enough knowledge of these particular policy problems to figure out what the right connections should be. So, leadership was funding, it was figuring out the right work for this organization, and then nurturing it all along the way. We have definitely seen the benefits of that. And I do think that, it's been really helpful to have a dedicated funding source. We make the case all the time, but you can also figure out ways, I think, decide to just get smarter about how you're funding technology projects within the domains that foundations will fund. But I really think that Chicago has benefited from this place where we've got a dedicated funding source and funding stream, we have ongoing commitment and participation by our mayors on this, which is absolutely critical. And we have a place to convene the sort of assembly that you all have to sort of to keep talking about this issue as it evolves, because otherwise we'll continue to evolve. So that's what I say.
That's great. Alaina, I'd love to come back to you in a few minutes with a question, but obviously want to respect your time and the connection that we have. So one of the other questions that I'd like to ask you is, when you think about traditional philanthropy that traditionally thinks about outcomes and funds outcomes, right? How has MacArthur become comfortable with thinking about technology and in this ever-changing world in a way that allows you to be agile and nimble with the things that you fund, knowing that there may be an implicit risk in some of the things that you fund, and you're not sure whether or not they're going to actually drive the outcomes. Can you talk about that leadership that you've been able to provide within the foundation and helping think about balancing that risk?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting time to be talking about risk and big bets. I don't know if anyone saw, we recently published our essay from our president and talked about this notion that we need to take bigger risks and really be out there on some of these frontier issues. So that's something that MacArthur has really embraced and has been embracing and will continue to embrace. But I think the other thing, the flip side of that, as you mentioned, is rigor of NCAP measurement. And I think we really pushed for this for a long time around our broadband work. One of the early things we supported was an evaluation of our broadband technology opportunity program implementation. So that's the big federal grant supported deep engagement and neighborhood broadband work. And we did find something really important through that research, which was that having an organization focused on neighborhood improvement, not just focus on getting broadband in, but focus on how people would use it to make change in their lives, was absolutely critical. In the neighborhoods where we had deep programming and worked with liNKCity smart communities program in place, and actual people on the ground telling folks this is how the internet can help improve your life, those places showed more increase in people using the internet, an increase in home broadband connections, and an increased ability to access the kinds of job training programs, educational programs, all of the things that we're looking for. And I think the challenge in this space is that, the internet's kind of an intermediate outcome. Getting access to it doesn't guarantee that anything will happen. But there are ways, there's research that shows that it's absolutely critical to pursuing all of the different avenues to that we care about. We're invested in building those demonstrations as well as, investing in evidence-based practices. So I think this is such a frontier space that what's really needed is a lot of investment in demonstration projects. So getting out there and taking some risk, but then putting in place the kinds of evaluation mechanisms and processes that help us understand and learn from what's happening, and then sharing it with other cities, frankly. So we're so excited to learn from Kansas City with their Google Fiber implementation, and others, right? We're just at the beginning of this. So I think the critical thing is to reach for what's promising, and then put in place great measures to act with that.
That's great. Thanks so much. So Dane, yeah, thank you. Nice round of applause for you, Alaina. And we'll welcome you down anytime, and certainly hope you'll be able to make it again. So, Dane, I'd love to go to you also thinking about a national perspective from the Kauffman Foundation angle, but also from a hyper-localized perspective. One of the things that I would love for you to talk about and maybe share is, where have you also seen clusters of economic opportunity around these tech-based infrastructure plays, and how are those driving entrepreneurship? How are those driving potentially education in some of these communities? And maybe have a couple of other questions quickly to ask you.
Sure. Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Alaina, and thanks to Aaron and everyone who organized this this event. We're really delighted to be a part of it. There's a lot in Alaina's comments I could respond to as well in terms of how foundations and philanthropy work, and she makes a lot of good points about kind of the nature of the philanthropic outlook and how foundations do or don't view risk. But to Luke's specific question, one of the things that Kauffman has been looking at both here in Kansas City and in other metros is what Luke mentioned, which is how do these clusters, both clusters of tech companies and clusters of other types of companies, come together or don't come together in different communities. And one observation about Kansas City, building off something Aaron said, is that the emerging tech cluster, or really at this point the very well-developing tech cluster that Kansas City has, as Aaron said, did not start with Google Fiber. We did a paper a few years ago that I'm sure everyone has read and internalized by now, that looked at the growth of tech startup, especially IT startup density across the US at the MSA level, at the metro level. And to our surprise, Kansas City, among large metro areas, so San Francisco, Austin, the big city, Chicago, Kansas City had the fastest growth in IT startup density from 1990 to 2010. So bringing us right to the cusp of Google Fiber. And I mention that because when you see these clusters develop, whether it's a tech cluster, or a biotech cluster, or a medical device cluster, or any other type of cluster, manufacturing cluster, they have very, very deep roots in these cities. They develop over time. They develop through lots of people. They develop through entrepreneurs, which Kauffman works to help support. And they develop because those people get kind of recycled through the generations. So they found a company or they work at a big company, and then they go on to do something else or to work for another startup. And so the things that cities do or not do to help those clusters emerge are facilitate those networks and that movement of people. We've talked a lot here tonight about networks and the connections between people and those nodes and those leaders. And it often comes down to just that, is there's one or two people in that community who are making that connection. Some people call these people deal makers because they're making equity deals or they're making other deals happen. We've seen this emerge in what we used to call, or still call, I guess, the Silicon Prairie, right, in Kansas and Missouri and Iowa and Nebraska. So up in places like Lincoln and Omaha, they kind of came out of nowhere and became these really tech hotspots on the prairie because they just had a few people who were founding companies and then went on to work for something else or went on to do something in the community. And you've had some really moderate to big successes come out of those communities and launch themselves onto the national stage because they had this density develop in the downtown areas. They had these connections develop, and they were able to launch some really significant companies. I think that's the pattern that at least we see in Kansas City, in Nebraska, and elsewhere, is that these develop over long periods of time. You see this talent, this entrepreneurial talent, recycled through companies and through institutions, and then you have these deal makers or these nodes bring a lot of these connections together. And just because they're called deal makers doesn't mean they're always going to be the investors or the people with money or the high-tech guys. That's going to be institutions like the library. It's going to be institutions like Digital Drive. But those are kind of the soft or the social infrastructure that Aaron talked about that we see. And the important thing about these clusters that emerge is that you can't build them or you shouldn't build them vertically. Like every state wants to build a biotech cluster. You know, there's like 340 biotech clusters across the US in 340 cities across the US. And they all focus on this vertical, or we're going to have these companies, these companies. And the importance of clusters for any city or state is the horizontal connections among them. It's people who move in between different industries or companies and are able to transfer that knowledge or that innovation or that experience across different companies. So when we talk about Kansas City and the emerging tech cluster, we do have those major horizontal links across companies, which is a really good thing. If we had gone kind of the vertical approach, we would have hit a lot of brick walls that some other cities have hit. So that's kind of some of the patterns that we're seeing that we're trying to learn from in other places as well.
That's great. So 2 quick follow-on questions. The first about diversity, right? So Lisa Gansky, Lisa Mitchell, who used to be at the Kauffman Foundation, have talked a lot about the importance of a diverse community and the people coming in and out of the community through universities, but the different perspectives. So would love just any thoughts you have around the diversity, certainly building off of what Mayor Holland talked about, is it once being a risk and now it's truly an opportunity. And then the second question, if you can quickly respond, when you think about the investments that Kauffman may make in things like its cities initiative, right? Can those efforts be successful without long-term, multi-year, potentially million-dollar investments? Or can they be successful with lots of one-off little investments?
Yeah, sure. Quick response. No problem, Luke.
Quickish.
So yeah, quickish. So the first question on diversity, we've, as part of some of our research work, so I work in the research and policy department at Kauffman, and so we approach this from a research perspective, a data perspective, a policy perspective, and we have been thinking really hard about how you measure all the stuff that we're talking about tonight. And Alaina talked about the data and the measurement and the impact evaluation around these efforts. And we kept getting these questions when we'd go out in Kansas City or go to other cities, which is, you, Kauffman, keep talking about entrepreneurial ecosystems, but like, how do we know if we're making any progress? What do we track? What do we measure? And so we tried to answer this question for ourselves in a non-academic way. Just what are some things that communities can track, whether it's a mayor's office or a nonprofit or another organization? And we came up with these 4 kind of broad indicators, and they each have 3 sub-indicators in the spirit of true research. But one of those indicators is diversity. And we mean diversity writ large. This is not just about counting. This is not about meeting quotas or checking boxes. It's the diversity of who is able to participate. Who do you have coming in and out? Is your tech sector, is your biotech sector, is your manufacturing, whatever your entrepreneurship area is it open to inclusion? There's a lot of places around the US that talk a really good game about startup community, but then you go to their events, their much vaunted events, and it's like, it's Pleasantville. It's the same person at every single thing and every type of person. And so it's diversity also in terms of, is it open to people up and down, also the income stack. And that's the digital inclusion and the digital divide that we've talked about tonight. There are very serious issues with mobility and opportunity, and not just around entrepreneurship and digital access, but from an entrepreneurial perspective for your ecosystem, are you able to engage, what startup community folks call the full stack, and not just the full stack in types of people and, your background, but people from kind of all walks of life. And we think that is a huge indicator of diversity. And if you kind of look at some broad economic indicators across metro areas, the extent to which someone can move up or down, kind of the socioeconomic ladder, is a huge indicator of that community's economic success. And if you're not engaging everyone, you're gonna kind of hold yourself back as a community or as a metro area. So to Luke's very short question about Kauffman, no, you can't. Foundations talk a really good game about systemic change. But that often adds up to not much, because there's a lot of one-off projects that foundations lose interest after. Foundations have long been accused of projectism, which is just funding a lot of projects and then not following up on them. And so, as Luke mentioned, we're doing a lot more engagement in cities across the U.S., starting with 4 cities, Kansas City being one of the 4. But treating those not, we're not going to come in to a Kansas City or a Burlington or a Nashville and change them overnight, but engage with them on very specific, discrete things that, based on our research, based on other work, we think can kind of move the needle over a 1 or 2 year horizon on a very specific aspect of entrepreneurship, not the whole pie, and then learn from those places as to what's holding back entrepreneurship. Because in a lot of these places, and again, remember, I work in the policy department. But what are the policy barriers and opportunities in these places? What holds back opportunity and what holds back inclusion? There's a lot of stuff. I mean, we've made a lot of strides in the U.S. There's still a lot of stuff, a lot of policies at the city and state level that hamper entrepreneurship, or that protect, intentionally or not, that protect kind of those incumbent established companies and unwittingly or intentionally keep out entrepreneurs. So we're hoping to not only move the needle on very discrete, specific aspects of an ecosystem, but also learn things from different places that we can then apply in Kansas City and elsewhere.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dane. So if anyone hasn't heard her name yet tonight, or has not ever heard her name, you need to Google her and you need to follow her. Her name is Deb Socia, and she is someone that I think is at the epicenter of everything we've been talking about tonight, and a national and internationally visible person who we're incredibly lucky to have here. Deb, I think Mayor James talked about the quote that you said, that there's something going on in Kansas City that everyone else needs to pay attention to, not only in Kansas City, but around the globe. And I would love for you just to share your perspective on what is it that we're doing and what is it that we need to continue doing to make sure that we are really building the future epicenter of the world.
Well, honestly, I feel like it's all been said. You've got amazing people here today. Oh, I'm supposed to stand up. Not that it helps a lot, but and I do have to tell you that the whole reason we have short chairs is because my legs are too short to climb up on the tall ones. So that's part of the deal. So I think what's happening here is pretty dang exciting. I love hearing what's happening from Aaron. I follow a whole bunch of these projects on Twitter. And if you're not following them, you should, because it's so exciting. I think the cool part is that you've got the package, right? And the package means you've got mayors who really care about this and support it. You've got mayors who were brilliant enough to realize that just getting Google Fiber here wasn't going to change anything if you didn't take advantage of it. And how do you take advantage of it? You gotta have somebody who's in charge. And in every city that's successful, and there aren't tons of them out there, they have a person and an organization. Here you've got KC Digital Drive, and you've got Aaron and Jason, and that's why you're able to sort of coordinate all of this, right? Because when you start talking about as many different groups working on this as you've got here, you gotta have somebody in charge. If I'm gonna call Kansas City, I'm gonna call Aaron. right? I know who to talk to, I know who's got the story, I know who can connect me where I need to be connected. And in a city, you gotta have that. And I think that that's got to be the goal for all of our cities. And a couple of our cities have come close, and the mayor earlier, or maybe it was Aaron, mentioned Ken Hayes from Chattanooga, who works in the Enterprise Center. Great guy, he's my go-to person there. If I'm calling Boston, I'm calling Nigel Jacobs from the Office of New Urban Mechanics. I know he's the go-to guy there. And I think you've got to have that if you're really going to get the kind of influence and outcomes that you're looking for. But I will put in a plug on the side of helping them be sustainable. And because as a nonprofit, we're a national nonprofit, I support 106 cities across the country. Kansas City MO and Kansas City K, you say KCM, you say KCMO, right? And KCK. Both of them, our Next Century Cities, came on board very early because you got visionary leadership. But if you're going to be really successful, you have to be able to empower KC Digital Drive to do this work without spending all of their time worrying about next quarter's funding. It's a waste of their incredible talent and their incredible brilliance to have them always having to struggle with that. And I think it's something definitely worth some energy to think about.
That's great. Maybe while you're still standing, or
Okay.
if you'll
While I'm
stand again. When you think of other cities or other metros that are doing things, what are the specific outcomes that you're seeing coming out of those that you also think we can learn from?
There's some folks doing some incredible stuff around the country. And I think one of the things that's most important to remember is that just having, I work with cities that have a gig, cities that aspire to have a gig, cities that have no idea what they should do, but they want to get there. They're all looking at you, by the way. So you may be looking outward, which is awesome. You should pay attention to what's happening, but other people are looking at you and contacting you. Aaron, thank you for always taking my calls and talking to cities that are interested. But I look at what's happening, for example, in Wilson, North Carolina, which, they sort of targeted their energy. And they actually are one of the capitals of film production in the country. They used to be the tobacco capital, and now they're the capital of film production. You know why? They got a gig and they marketed it well. You have to have a market. You have to have a marketing strategy and a marketing organization that really continues to push that. It's sort of like building a bonfire. You've got that bonfire. It's really well engulfed in flames. It's huge and everybody's paying attention because you got all these great press releases about Google Fiber and so forth. But if there isn't somebody continually feeding that fire, it's going to smolder and die. And so you've got that here. And some of our cities have it as well. Chattanooga does, certainly. I'm sure you've seen, if you haven't seen their newest commercials about fibervention, you should peek. They're hysterical. Some other cities that have done really cool stuff, Lafayette, Louisiana has really done a great job, brought in 1,200 jobs in the last couple of years that are paying $60,000 a year or above, which is huge. And so thinking about what those folks are doing to market their gig and to bring in the kind of energy that you're looking for, and then continuing to grow and change and build what you've done, I think that's really would be my suggestion.
That's great. Well, another huge thanks to Alaina, Dane, and Deb for joining us. The big thing that I would ask, if you each could quickly respond, how can we, either KC Digital Drive or these organizations, best frame for you the opportunities that we need help with? Is there one singular piece of advice that you could quickly summarize?
I think the one thing I would say that you're doing quite well is just having a go-to source and really highly elevating that go-to source so that for all things digital, for all things economic development, education, healthcare, transportation, public safety, that are related to the tech interventions, that you've got a go-to source. And that go-to source is KC Digital Drive, and elevating that as much as you can so that people know who to get to when they have a question or an interest, or they want to move their business here.
I mean, I think Aaron said it best, which was kind of his framing of big ideas and small projects. And so, my advice would be just connect it to common things. I mean, despite the energy around the digital drive and every person in this room, I mean, most people in the Kansas City area are not going to have heard of it or are going to have very limited, digital skills. And so I think just connect it to kind of common issues, things like transportation, the problems or the challenges people face every day.
Alaina, maybe to you, any input you would have on, how best to position asks to foundations, thinking about those needs for the long-term plays, but the short-term opportunities? Did you hear us? All right. Well, again, thanks to everyone. Thanks to Alaina for joining us by Skype. Dane, thanks as well. Deb, of course, for coming in. And thank you again to Jason and Aaron for a really amazing event.